All right. Hey, world history. What is absolutely crazy to me is that this is the last 9 weeks starting today. And of course, welcome back from spring break. Hope you guys had a great one. I don't know about y'all, but coming home from or coming back to work right there at the start of daylight savings time was a little rough, but it is what it is. Every year I have students tell me at the end of the year, I really wasn't loving your class. And, I wasn't convinced that world history was all that great until this last 9 weeks. And it's because it is sincerely action packed from here on out. We are starting the French Revolution and Napoleon Bonaparte uh, for this unit. And when I say that, heads will roll and there will be blood in the streets, I mean that like in a very literal way. So, we've got the French Revolution and Napoleon, followed by the Industrial Revolution, followed by World War I and the Russian Revolution, and then World War II and the Holocaust. So when I say action packed, hold on to your hats because I mean it. So it's going to be, one major change and war after another. So, with that being said, let's get started. The French Revolution and Napoleon and the Napoleonic Wars is going to take up the next 2 weeks of our time. So, this week is lessons 1 and 2 of Unit 10. So, today is going to be like lesson 1, part 1. And then tomorrow will, of course, be like lesson 1, part 2. And then on Wednesday, we'll go on to lesson 2. So, those of you that listen in to these at home, if you're kind of like, well, she didn't get all the way through lesson 1 today. Well, it's because it's just kind of hard to. As always, watch the embedded videos in the slideshow. They really help drive the material home. And give you not just, a little bit more detail, but give you some visuals to grasp your mind around the time frame and the people and the events. So those videos are pretty important to watch. I don't add them in there for my own health. I want you to watch them. So all right, with that being said, let's start the French Revolution. So when I say heads will roll, again, I mean literal, but you have to understand, okay, how do we get from almost a millennia, so close to 1,000 years of having a French monarch, a French king and queen, to revolution and people's heads being chopped off in the thousands, and then and just radicalized chaos. How do you get there? So today is looking at the causes, right, of the French Revolution. What caused it? So I've mentioned the Estates General before, very briefly, but I said, kind of stick that in the back of your brain. It's going to come back into play. The Estates General is the representative body of France, and they created it. They created it not long after Britain created Parliament. Because it was kind of like, okay, if they're going to do it, we're going to do it. But the Estates General, highly ineffective. There was no Magna Carta that the French monarch had to sign, saying that he has to convene the Estates General or that he has to cooperate with his nobility. That didn't exist in France. So whereas, Britain's monarchs had a signed document saying you have to recognize Parliament and you have to, listen to your nobility, France didn't have to do that. And so I think, don't quote me on this, but I'm pretty sure that there was a time period in French history where it was like over 300 years and the Estates General was never called upon by the French kings. So, I mean, again, really not utilized, highly ineffective. And this is one of the causes. This is part of the problem. Okay. So if you're kind of like, well, why is it called the Estates General? Well, the estates are what they called their social classes. Their society was divided into essentially these 3 estates: the first estate, the second estate, and the third estate. So the first estate are your clergy. And of course, these are your church officials. France, if you'll remember, has never split from the Catholic Church. They have remained Catholic even through the Reformation and the 30 Years' War and all of that. They've remained Catholic. And so, that's still a highly influential institution in France. And so, you've got, again, Catholic officials, aka your clergy, as pretty big parts of society. Now, I want you to pay attention to these numbers, okay? Because this is part of the problem. All right. So the first estate is the clergy. We are in the late 1700s, so like the 1780s. All right. The clergy makes up 130,000 out of 27 million people total, and they own 10% of the land. Okay. Your second estate are your nobility. Okay. You're highly, highly wealthy, your aristocratic families. Okay. So this is like generational wealth. The nobility are the people that, of course, the king and queen are surrounded by. These are your dukes and your, viscounts and your marquets and your lords and ladies. This is the nobility. And they number 350,000 and own 25 to 30% of the land. Okay, so just do some quick math. If you'll remember, the clergy's 130,000, your nobility's 350,000. So it's 480,000 people. So let's just round up, make it easy, 500,000. Okay, so you've got 500,000 people, and that sounds like a whole heck of a lot. I get it, but this is out of 27 million total that live in France in the 1780s. Okay, so 500,000 out of 27 million are in control of about 40% of the land. Okay, the biggest issue is that they also, also having kind of, clearly a disproportioned land to numbers ratio here, they don't pay the taille, which is France's chief and annual tax. They don't have to pay it. They're exempt from paying it. So, of course, where in the world does your heaviest tax burden land? Well, it lands on the other 26.5 million people that live in France. And in your brain, you might be going, well, that's 26.5 million people. That's still a lot of people. But guys, this isn't 26.5 million people that are like strong, middle class, like that. No. 75 to 80% of your third estate, which is everybody else, are peasants. Okay, these are people living, as we've talked about before, hand to mouth existences. They are barely surviving. You have to think, in addition to the discrepancy here in wealth and tax sharing, you have the Little Ice Age wreaking havoc. It gets particularly bad, if you will remember, in the late 1700s. And so you've got crop failures and famine and disease. And of course, when you've got that stuff going on, it's affecting your lowest members of society, your poorest, your most in need. And so they aren't doing well. Peasants are not doing well. I mean, it's not like they can provide a large amount of tax income to the government. Okay, so your biggest burden of taxes falls on the bourgeoisie, or the middle class. Okay, these are your merchants, your industrialists, your professionals, that are educated, but they're not nobles. Okay, they're educated working people doing well for themselves, for the most part, but they only make up about 20% of the population. So you have almost the entire tax burden of a nation falling on the shoulders of 20% of the people. And that is just, of course, an insanely unsustainable model. So, this is what I'm kind of talking about, even with my in person, kids, is, this is just kind of economics 101 that I'm going to take a second and talk to you about. And understanding history is also understanding just like basic civics and economics. And so this is kind of a part of that. So if you want a financially successful country, okay, and it doesn't matter if you are 18th century France or 21st century America, you want a very large middle class. Okay, you want a middle class that is working, that is thriving, okay, and that, are paying their taxes, but also having a little bit of money on the side to, maybe to go on vacation or go to the movies or something like that. And so if you squeeze that particular group of people, okay, to the point where that little bit of disposable income that they do have has to go to taxes, and it can't go towards that vacation or, that, maybe that new car that we've been saving up for, or, maybe that, replacing the floors in our kitchen, or, something like that. If all of that stops, then, that hurts an economy, because those are the kind of things that drive an economy. I mean, the middle class, we are the wheels to this machine. All right. And so again, and you can't have an entire tax burden falling on really the most productive members of your society. And, and again, there's a big difference, obviously, between what 18th century France looked like and what 21st century America looks like in terms of, poverty versus the size of the middle class versus the size of your uber wealthy. But still, it doesn't matter. Like your budget and your economic viability as a nation is not going to do well if you are relying on either a small percentage of people trying to produce the wealth through taxes that you need for your nation, or squeezing them to death. I mean, like, it doesn't work. So the middle class is clearly very unhappy with the fact that the nobles and the clergy do not pay the taille. And then, they are just being, driven into obscurity, and they're sitting here going, hello, like, we're the people that you need. If you want to have France truly continue to be successful, and you are squeezing us financially to death here. These are also educated people. These are people who can read and write. And guys, this is the late 1700s. You also have the Enlightenment very much playing a part in this, just like it played a part, of course, in the minds of the Americans during the American Revolution. They were frustrated by the British tax. In that sense, the French and American Revolution are very similar. Okay, you've got middle class, working, educated people reading the ideas of the Enlightenment philosophers, who were predominantly French, okay, and going, absolutely, like, why don't we create change? Why don't we try to do this? And then boom, you have the American Revolution create an incredible example of success in terms of, oh my gosh, this tiny little colony that definitely wasn't supposed to win beat the British, which in large part thanks to the French. We'll get into that in a minute. But they beat the British, and then they've set up a government based on Enlightenment ideology. So now we have an example. Now we have an example of success. So, all of a sudden you've got several factors kind of fueling people's desire for change. Okay. So social conditions coupled with Enlightenment ideas, in addition to the French budget fixing to collapse, the little ice age wreaking havoc on crops, and therefore creating famine and bread shortage and inflation. I mean, like, it's the perfect storm, guys. If I even just had mentioned one or two of those things, we would be in trouble. But you start to add all of this together, and on top of all of that, you throw in a completely ridiculous king and queen who are insanely out of touch with reality and very, very stupid. and not leading and living in this cocoon of luxury at Versailles, I mean, people are going to get real done real fast. Okay. So, in the last unit, we talked about the 7 Years' War. And of course, this is, predominantly between the French and the British. Here in the United States, it's also known as the French and Indian War. But so the 7 Years' War creates massive debt for Britain and for France. But if you will remember, Britain won that war, and so they had tons of colonies that then they started taxing. And of course, this is what leads to the American Revolution, the no taxation without representation thing. But France lost that war, remember? So they lost a ton of colonies and therefore a lot of money, that they lost a lot of income coming out of that and the ability to tax and exploit, those colonies. And so they are in a lot of debt. And the only people that can really kind of bear the brunt of that debt are the actual French people, not necessarily their colonial exploits. And then, in addition to the debt of the 7 Years' War, when the American Revolution starts, Louis XVI, who is the king at the time of the French Revolution, is all like, oh my gosh, I'm going to avenge our loss from the 7 Years' War, and I'm going to help out these Americans, and I'm going to see them beat the British. Well, I mean, as an American, thank you so much, Louis, for really appreciate it. But from a, of course, French perspective, this is disastrous because they're already broke. They are already taxing the people to death, and they can't afford anything. And now we're going to go help these Americans beat the British with what money? Who knows? I mean, and of course, Louis is such such a ridiculously uneducated, so out of touch king that he's just like, well, it'll be fine. We'll just tax the people more. Like, no big deal. He doesn't even understand the state in which his country and his people are already existing in. And part of that is due to Versailles. Louis the 14th, remember the Sun King, of course, he builds Versailles. And, the kings and queens of France, of course, are still living there. Why wouldn't you want to? And, but in that same breath, Versailles is this isolated, gilded paradise, where they are so out of touch with their own people that it's just, they're just spoiled, entitled little brats. I mean, that's what it boils down to. It's well, I'm king and I'm just always going to be king, and that's the way it is, and God ordained it so. And I'm supposed to live in this luxury and have balls and parties and champagne flowing from the heavens all the time. And it's not like I'm ever going to go hungry. I mean, I'm the king, she's the queen. No, we don't go hungry. I mean, it's off the backs of the people that we get to have all of this, because that's their duty, and our duty is to be their king and queen. I mean, it's just the mentality, obviously completely at odds with the American mentality, and again the ideas that the Enlightenment were creating in people. I mean, people were done with that. They were like, no, this absolute monarchy and you living in luxury while the rest of us starve to death is over. We're done. So after the American Revolution, the French budget completely collapses. I mean, they're officially broke as a joke. And so this is when the tide really, really starts to turn in France. So this is, again, a great video. I want you to watch it. It's less than 8 minutes. So please do that. Plus, it'll be a good way to kind of break up this little lecture. So, all right. Louis the 16th is going to, hear from his ministers, and his people that advise him, hey, man, things are getting kind of bad. People are really getting mad. And he's like, well, let's call the Estates General. Nobody's called that in a long time. And maybe if I do that, that'll make them think I care. Let's let them think they have a voice for a little bit. Maybe that'll kind of appease them, right? So here's the biggest problem again with the Estates General. Number one, again, it's a joke. It hardly ever gets called upon. And the thing is, the Estates General isn't voted, like the things that they vote on, the way in which they count the vote is not by individual votes. Okay? Each estate only gets one vote. Okay? Well, this is not difficult to understand. The first and second estate are always going to vote together. All right? Because they have the most to gain. And you know, and it's all about like, why in the world would the first and second estate ever vote to tax themselves? And of course, when he calls the National Assembly on May 5th, 1789, that is exactly what the third estate shows up wanting. They're like, okay, so you've called us here to this National Assembly. What we need as a nation and is for the first and second estate to start paying tax. Like, they have got to start contributing. We cannot keep shouldering this ourselves. You're literally killing us. We can't do it anymore. And of course, you know, they're like, oh yeah, well, let's put it to a vote. Well, we know how that goes. They're going to be like, first estate, how do you vote? Nay. Second estate, how do you vote? Nay. Oh, 2-1. Sorry. I mean, like, so the third estate is never going to get anywhere with this, right? They're never ever going to be truly represented because the first and second estate are always going to side together. So no shocker here. The third estate's like, this is stupid. We're going to draft a constitution because we need to move towards a constitutional monarchy or some form of constitutional government like the Americans. And, you know, if y'all won't listen to reason and if y'all won't have anything to do with us or let us truly have a voice, fine, forget you. And so on June 17th, 1789, they declare that this is what they're going to do. And this is how out of touch Louis is. This is kind of funny. So he goes and has the banquet hall that they are meeting in. He goes and has the doors locked because he's like, ha, what are you going to do now? If you can't get into the hall and, you know, and meet, then what are you going to do? And it's because in his mind, his life is so ritualized. I mean, you have to remember what life is like at Versailles, right? They open the curtain for him to wake up in the morning bathed in sunshine, and he doesn't even dress himself, guys. Like, these people don't even put on their own clothes. And so in his mind, he's like, well, if I've locked the banquet hall, then you can't meet. Of course, the third estate's like, so there's a tennis court right over here that looks like it's got enough room, so we'll just go over there. And of course, Louis like, wait, what? No, I locked the doors. I mean, again, this is just how like out of touch and ridiculous life at Versailles. What, you know, this is what life at Versailles has created. Just absolute ridiculous entitlement and completely out of touch with reality. So 3 days later, on June 20th, they they meet at the tennis courts and swear again, like, we're gonna stay here until we create a new constitution, and this is known as the tennis court oath. Okay, so this is really kind of the first big step towards, you know, making a stand and saying, you know, like, no, we're not just gonna lay down and take it anymore. Well, it gets back to Paris that, you know, this has happened, that the third estate has locked themselves into this tennis court at Versailles, and that they are drafting a constitution. And of course, the people in Paris are like, yeah, I mean, you know, because everybody's just been waiting on something, you know, like there's got to be some type of reprieve coming. And so to the people that are already just angry and rioting and upset due to the conditions of their lives, they're like, oh, here's our moment. Okay. And so when Louis hears that, you know, the people in Paris are really standing behind this tennis court oath, and that they're all, you know, like everybody's like kind of getting excited, and you know, we're gonna you know, create this constitutional government, he sends troops into Paris to suppress these people. And of course, this is just not okay. I mean, there's like, here is the example of what we are trying to show you has to change. You know, you cannot fight back this necessary change any longer. And so on July 14th, 1789, about 900 to 1,000 Parisians stormed the Bastille. Okay, and this is a big moment in history, the storming of the Bastille. And what it's a prison, but it's also viewed as this kind of like symbol of the monarch's tyranny and oppression, because a lot of the people that were imprisoned in the Bastille were like political prisoners. So they're the ones that kind of were openly speaking out against the monarchy and trying to like create the change that now the revolution might provide. And so they storm the Bastille. It's also conveniently an armory. So they take over all the armory. They actually chop the head off of the warden's body. So I mean, here's the first round of the French chopping heads off. They stick it on a pike, parade it through the streets of Paris. I mean, it gets pretty crazy. And then they tear the Bastille down brick by brick. Okay, to show like we are going to topple this tyranny. It was very like symbolic move. And so the storming of the Bastille is very much the beginning of the French Revolution. July 14th to this day is Bastille Day in France. It's like their declaration, it's their Independence Day. And so July 14th, 1789, with the storming of the Bastille, the French Revolution begins. Okay. So that is where we're going to stop for today. We will pick back up tomorrow at the storming of the Bastille and kind of what that creates in terms of its ripple effects, which are a lot. And just a little bit of a spoiler alert if you're like, oh, it's going to be like the American Revolution. No. Okay, like apples and oranges here. The French Revolution is going to get real crazy. So hang on tight, kiddos. So I will see you tomorrow for lesson 1, part 2. And as always, if you have any questions, just shoot me an email. Bye, guys.